Welcome to the DaveCast for Thursday, January 28th. Today we're going to be finishing the Beatitudes that appear at the beginning as the introduction of the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to look at 3 verses from Matthew 5, verses 10, 11, and 12. And so let me begin by reading those for us, all right? Jesus continues, Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And so, in saying these things, Jesus serves notice to his disciples, to his followers, that those who are following him faithfully should expect to experience a measure of rejection. Notice that Jesus doesn't say, blessed are you if people insult you. Jesus says, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you. And so there is very much a tone of inevitability here. I mean, it's going to happen. Not all the time, but sometimes. It's not if, it's when. Because it is true that Jesus can bring people together. I mean, in some ways, that's the great hope of the gospel. And at the restoration of all things, it will happen. I mean, creation will be reconciled. And so in the here and now, we do get to see the kingdom breaking in, and it's awesome when it happens. I mean, husbands and wives who have stopped loving one another, children who are estranged from their parents, neighbors whose relationships have crumbled, they can all testify to the power the gospel has to heal and to bring people together. I mean, that is the good news of the kingdom. But also in this world, Jesus can come between people. In Matthew 10, 34 and 35, he says, Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be members of his own household. Now, there is context to this passage, and it shouldn't serve as a proof text that disunity is inevitable, because Jesus wants believers to live in unity, to live as one, as He and the Father are one, as Jesus will later say in John's Gospel, and Paul will later spell out in 1 Corinthians. But as we follow Christ, we should expect that there are some who will not be on board with us, and persecution is inevitable. Again, it's not if, it's when it does happen. And Jesus says, then we are blessed. But it is important to note, rejection is a mark of blessing only when it is for the sake of righteousness. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, is what Jesus says. And so, when does Jesus say that insults, persecutions, and slander are a reason to rejoice? When it's for His sake. And this is a very important clarification, because there's a danger that we will misapply Jesus' words. Without this class of clarification, we might be tempted to think that it is a blessing anytime someone insults us. You know, I think of people who I've heard use this verse as a reason for what they're going through over the years. And there's a lot of times I think that they've missed Jesus' point here about the kingdom that He is announcing. Some things that I've heard people use as evidence that they are being persecuted for righteousness' sake is really not persecution for righteousness' sake. You know, sometimes what they have labeled as persecution is just a natural and reasonable reaction to their bad behavior or misguided notions. People aren't really being rejected because they're followers of Christ. They've been rejected because they are bad-tempered and rude. They've been rejected because they are petulant and childish. They've been rejected because they are hypersensitive and hard to get along with. If I could be so bold to say, they are being rejected because they're just being jerks. Not all suffering that we go through is evidence that we're being persecuted for righteousness' sake. You know, sometimes suffering is just a part of living in this world. For example, the doctor diagnoses you with a serious illness, or your company downsizes you and you get laid off from your job. In those cases, suffering is not because of a person's Christian faith, but it's simply because we're living in this world. Later on in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5:45, Jesus says that God causes His sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, there are some blessings in life. They're simply a matter of common grace. Everybody experiences them, whether they deserve them or not. But also, the opposite is true. There are some troubles that are just universally experienced. I think of those folks living on the Gulf Coast this past year, the ones who experienced all the hurricanes and destructive storms in the midst of the pandemic. And don't hear me wrong, not that I ever heard any of them attribute their suffering to this verse. But my point is simply this, that their suffering was just a function of location. It rains on the righteous and the unrighteous. All of us, every one of us who has ever lived, at some time or another are going to suffer troubles and hardships just because it is the nature of this world we're presently living in. But also, and this is the key point today, as a follower of Jesus who strives to walk in this kingdom, there will also be a kind of suffering and persecution that is inevitable for those who choose to follow Him, to walk this path. And so let's go back to those verses once again. Let me read those one more time. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. One of the things that I'm really noticing as I've been studying the Sermon on the Mount for this study that we're working through is that there is great intentionality and purpose in the way Jesus is laying out this teaching. These 3 chapters here in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, they're so wonderful and they're chock full of so many great verses that we often hear them given in bits and pieces. But as Jesus is rolling this out, so to speak, what comes before directly informs what comes after. And in the next few verses, right after the Beatitudes, actually the verses that we're going to be getting to on Saturday of this week, Jesus is talking about salt and light. And He says, you are the light of the world. Now here's the thing about light. We need it to see, right, where we're going. If we don't have light, we're just fumbling around in the dark. So for people living in darkness, light can be a great gift so they can see the way, so they can see the world. But also, for people living in darkness, light can be shocking and offensive. Think about this, which I know we've all experienced at one time or another. You're sitting in a dark, dimly lit room and suddenly someone walks in with a really, really bright light. So what do? The first reaction might be to kind of shield your eyes. It's stunning, it's shocking, until your eyes adjust. This kingdom of heaven, this kingdom of God that Jesus is ushering in is just that way. And some are going to like it at first, and for some, dare I say all of us, it might take some time to adjust our eyes to its brightness. And so as Jesus shines light on the law that He's come to fulfill, not to condemn, there are some who are going to reject it because it does not square with the way that they've been interpreting it. And so some of the folks who are going to be most offended by this kingdom are the ones who have thought themselves to be the most religious. They were walking in some other kind of life. And so as we finish this first section of the Beatitudes and transition into what logically and intentionally comes next in the Sermon on the Mount, we are going to see how that plays out. And we will begin that on Saturday. But for today, we're going to stop here. I do hope you have a good rest of the week, and I am really looking forward to Saturday as we continue our study of the Sermon on the Mount. So you all keep bringing the hope, and I will see you then. God bless you.